Hello and welcome to this reading about a restoration of the heart following the passing of a loved one. I'm going to read you a story about the death of my father some 11 years ago. And please make yourself comfortable and intake the experience as best you can, making notes, at least mental notes inside yourself of the things that touch you or seem to be learnings for you or that open something up in you. And of course, we'll have time to share about that in another way soon. So here we go. On New Year's Day, 2006, I received a call from my sister telling me that my father was in the hospital suffering from a serious heart incident, and that the medical staff were trying to get his heart strong enough to intervene. It was a shock to me as we had just been together for Christmas and had not even fully unpacked from the return drive. And at that time, Dad seemed to be in very fine health, at least for an 81-year-old man. As a psychologist in private practice, I had a full schedule in the coming days, so needed to get coverage and reschedule my appointments. But I told my sister that I would get my schedule cleared off and come home on January 4th, which was a Wednesday, just a few days away, at which time I'd be able to stay a couple of weeks and help Mom and Dad once he was home from the hospital. We hung up the phone and I began to make plans so that I could leave for a couple of weeks. Within an hour, my sister called back and said, "I've just spoken to the cardiologist and he says we would be lucky to make it to Wednesday." She continued saying, "Richard, you need to come home now." I was on a plane later that day. I went straight to the hospital when I landed, arriving around 10:30 in the evening. My mother was there with my dad, who was asleep at the time. She was standing watch, as my dad would have said, with a lovingly worried gaze, of course. I plopped down in the reclining chair, and Mom began to quietly fill me in on both his status and what had happened in the prior days. Even at 81, my father was still practicing as a psychologist in an office that he shared with my mother, who was a children's play therapist. The two of them loved their work and enjoyed working together, so neither of them were in a hurry to retire. They both had remained vibrant and active in the recent years. They had a small A-frame cabin on the lake where they could spend weekends in nature, relaxing, fishing, and enjoying this period in their lives. Yet my dad had confided with me over Christmas that he no longer felt strong enough to save my mother if something had happened while they were out on the lake. And then, in fact, the last time they had been out, a big storm had come up with high winds causing huge waves. And Dad said that he felt lucky to have made it back to shore without capsizing. That's all a way of saying that the seriousness of his heart event was a surprise, given his overall health. Mom went on to tell me that a few days prior, Dad had tripped coming out of the office, fallen, and had a hairline fracture in his left arm that was painful. They had been to the emergency room, received x-rays, evaluation, and treatment after that fall. He had been through 2 prior heart attacks some 10 years before. And because he was complaining of pain in his arm, they did do a full range of tests on his heart. And they determined that the pain he was experiencing was related to the fracture and not his heart. So they sent him home to rest. But as the next 24 to 48 hours unfolded, his symptoms would not abate. And eventually an ambulance was called and he returned to the hospital, where they discovered that he was in a more significant level of difficulty with his heart, and in fact was in quite a serious level of congestive heart failure. They admitted him into ICU. As the cardiologist said, his heart would need to be strengthened before they could intervene surgically. This was the backdrop that my mother and sisters had been sitting in as I arrived. We decided we would sit with Dad and sit in shifts so that he would not be alone. My mother didn't really want to leave, but she was not getting any rest at the hospital and agreed to the plan. At that point, although the prognosis was not officially optimistic, we were all still hoping that Dad would improve. After all, he had a strong constitution, and in fact, in the hospital, continued to be quite feisty during his waking hours. As the next day moved through, however, he drifted in and out of being quite cogent, while at other times being unable to grasp everything that was happening. In fact, he really just wanted to unhook from all the equipment and go home. Perhaps he knew something we didn't, but we were holding hope that he would improve. This was how the next 24 hours unfolded until the afternoon of the 2nd of January, when Dad finally drifted off to sleep, or perhaps some state of unconsciousness. We don't really know. We were actually relieved he was resting, but alarmed that he never did really come back to a fully awakened state over the next 10 hours. It was in the early morning hours of the 3rd of January when Mom and I got a call from my sisters saying we needed to come on up to the hospital because there had been an incident in which his heart had a very strong reaction when they were attempting to give him medicine via a feeding tube. My sisters had been in the midst of exploring every possible option with the nursing staff and doctors, but basically his heart was just too weak to intervene. And frankly, they thought he would likely pass away soon. My father had been, for some years, the consulting psychologist with the local hospice office. And so the director of hospice, who was also a friend of the family's, had come to the hospital when she heard of the urgent status that night. Mom was talking with her about what we needed to do to get him home. If he were indeed going to die, it was always his preference to be in his own bed at home when he died. In fact, they had kept an old iron bed from Louisiana, which had been moved up with the family when we moved to Texas some 42 years prior. It had layers and layers of paint on it, but was from a time that reminded Dad of his heritage, and it was special. I remember going into the room while Mom was attempting to sort things with the hospice director. My sisters and one brother-in-law were at Dad's bedside. And of course, tears were present with so much love and grief intermingled in our hearts. Dad was still connected to the monitoring devices, and each time it changed, we all looked up to see if there was any good news showing. But there was nothing we could take as hope of something turning around. For me, the most poignant moment prior to my father's death came when I was watching the monitor over the course of about 15 minutes. I supposed I was looking for some kind of knowledge of what was truly happening, or perhaps hope that it was not, and trying to discern how urgent this moment in time was to be. I watched over those few minutes as the number of respirations dropped from 15 per minute to 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, and finally to 9. Each time a new reading came up, it was lower and lower. It was when it hit 9 that I sensed that we were indeed living in the moments of his impending death. It was happening now. So I went to find Mom, who was trying to get Dad transported home. It was one of the hardest lines I ever had to muster, saying to anyone in my life, "Mom, I know you want to get Dad home to his own bed, but he's dying now, Mom." At first, the tears flowed, and I held her for a moment, and then she wiped the tears away and seemed truly ready. We walked back into the room, thickly interlaced with songs and tears of love and grief and prayers and songs of the heart and everything imaginable that could be part of a sacred moment. We were doing the best we could to let the love overflow the grief so that we would be swimming in the pure, clear, pristine waters of love as he passed. It was Mom who was the embodiment of that pure love. I remember it so clearly as she sat stroking Dad's face and hair with tears in her eyes, but not so much of grief, just the purest form of love I'd ever witnessed. I can still see it even at this moment. In that moment, she had a look of true surrender on her face, and the love and letting go came from some deep place within. Perhaps she was calling upon the love between them over the 56 years of their marriage. Perhaps grace had entered the room, as it often does when we need to hold the unbearable. Mom said what she wanted to say, to let him go, as did we each, in words, in songs, in prayers, in love. After that, Dad did not linger long. He was not one for long goodbyes. I remember at one point thinking I would have liked for him to be awake to say goodbye, but realized the selfishness of that for me. I think it would have been so painful for him to be conscious and aware of what was happening. Dad liked to make big entrances, but his exit was peaceful and still and filled with love. As I reflect on it now, I do think it was indeed grace that was given in honor of my father, allowing him to drift to the other side in peace. I remember the moment that he let go. We had removed the monitoring devices by then, as he had not been all that pleased being hooked up to them during these few days. The nurses had come in and taken them away, and I was holding his right hand. I put my finger on the pulse of his wrist, which was weak and slow. I don't know exactly what I was expecting to happen in the moment that he died. I don't really know what I was after, but I felt deeply connected to him in body and spirit, as did we all. And then a moment arrived when there was simply no pulse. It was not tragic, nor was there fanfare. I did not experience grief in that moment, but only a sense of stillness under his skin and peace in my own heart. The grief came later, make no mistake about it, but something sacred was present in the room. It was more than a sense that the struggle was no more. As best I can discern, the spirit of life, not death, was palpable in the room, and love was present in abundance. Now, I don't really know what happens on the other side of one's passage into death. I know that there are many things believed in faith and knowledge, and so many wise understandings through the great expanse of the history of humanity, but I don't really know what happens. But I can tell you my experience of what happened inside of me on this side of my father's passage into death. Something real and palpable and loving was reborn in me, as if I was looking into a new horizon of being in love with my father. If one can come to a sense of understanding about death, here's what was given to me in knowledge with my father and other important losses in the months and years to come. Death does not remove life from the world, nor does its presence come to consume our love and affection for another. When death arrives, it allows us to purify our hearts and sanctify the relationship in a way that allows us to hold life and death together, not as two competing forces, but as two complementary facets of the human experience. I want to read that line again. When death arrives, it allows us to purify our hearts and sanctify the relationship in a way that allows us to hold life and death together, not as two competing forces, but as two complementary facets of the human experience. If we do not open ourselves to the receipt of death, we do not open ourselves to the entire fullness of our life being lived in love. It's that simple. If we don't open ourselves to loss, we don't open ourselves to fall in love with the one who is leaving. But in the leaving, offering a joining on a new horizon that can only be seen through the lens of a pure and loving heart. The doctors and nurses went about completing the necessary steps of determining if death had arrived and at what time and what did we want done now and. But I found myself in a strangely open space, not at all what I expected. I was looking into a new horizon, even in that moment beginning to explore my relationship to love and my Father in a way that was thick with His presence and my own. I remember after everyone else left the room, as we were returning home, I got to the doorway and could not leave. It was a palpable and physical feeling of a barrier at the doorway, at the threshold. I was not complete in some way, or perhaps Dad was not complete. I can't say which one of us initiated, as it were, this blockage of my departure, but it was as real could be. I looked back at my father and turned around and started to leave again. I finally got that something more was here, so I turned around and sat back down next to my father, and I put my hand over his heart. I was not even aware of the contact of his skin, but instead of a unique phenomenon of connection that seemed beyond physical, yet very, very real. I closed my eyes, and in those next few minutes, I was graced with two moments or insights or signs or whatever they were. I don't really know. But each one would in their own way be life-altering for me. As I sat there with my hand on his heart, here's what happened. First, I heard the words that seemed to come from somewhere inside me, like something being peeled away and exposed to a new truth. And here were the words. It's just that simple, death. Just the absence of the same physical presence in the matters of the world. Just those words. The absence of the same physical presence in the matters of the world. Just a single moment of release and stillness arrives. I don't mean to minimize death. I don't mean to say it's pleasant or anything that any of us would want. But up until that point in my life, I'd been terrified of death. More a presence of nothing than death itself. But there was a palpable presence, even as my father's heart stopped. And that moment, a sense of peace arrived that would hold these complementary states of life being lived in the anticipation of the arrival or the presence of death, whatever that may be. I've not been afraid of death since I heard and felt those words. The next thing that happened was that I heard the words again, somewhere inside. I'm right here. I will always be here with you. They arrived really more as a sensation than words, and yet the words were present. And they didn't arrive through the usual senses. They seemed to be heard once again through my heart. I was not sure if it was me saying that to Dad or him saying that to me or some message from the force just bringing us together on that new horizon. But immediately the tears started to roll down my face, and I found myself saying out loud to my Father, I will always love you. I will speak about you, and I will keep you alive in here with me. The foundation of our new relationship was given in those moments, and I have continued to speak about my Father, his life, his love, and his noble purposes in ways that I think allow him to be remembered even by those who did not know him. What arrived was a deeper, richer love than I had ever been able to receive in the life we shared in this physical world. It has never dissipated since that day, 11 years ago to the day exactly, as I write this note. It was at that moment that I realized that there was a great illusion that had infiltrated our culture about, quote, needing to let somebody go, end quote, when they die. When we're following that belief as if it were real, we end up in an endless cycle of grief and loss. How do you keep love alive inside if you're sending someone away? What if grief were just the conduit to love, informing what wants our attention between us anew in the relationship? I'll read that again. What if grief were the conduit to love, informing what wants our attention between us anew in the relationship? I can see now that grief informs the edges of what we hold most dear about our loved ones. So if we choose, we can begin to consciously build a new relationship based on what is to be honored and embraced between us so that we can rekindle the love and let it shine wherever it seeks expression. Over these years, the grief has come and gone in me from time to time. And if I'm listening with my heart, it is always pointing to something that is drifting unnecessarily away, leaving a chamber in my heart feeling empty of the important matter of life and love of another. Also important is that grief informs the necessary healing of any disconnect that is happening and shines a light towards bringing the loved one alive inside one's heart. I'm going to read that line again. Also important is that grief informs the necessary healing of any disconnect that is happening and shines a light towards bringing the loved one alive inside one's heart. When that reconnection happens, then the grief and the focus on death is released. We don't need to let go of our loved one, only the feelings and experiences that seek to contaminate our heart and keep them at a distance from our love. Often this means letting go of some unresolved guilt or regret or upset that has transpired between us. These separating emotions and memories do want to be released so that we can fully hold the one who has passed in the warmth of our life. What was new to me then, and has stayed with me in the many other losses over the years, is that it's not necessary to let them go as long as they are alive and well inside our hearts. As well, the pure water of holding someone in our heart long after they leave the physical plane of the world becomes the tributary that returns us to the river of love. Read that again. The pure water of holding someone in our heart long after they leave the physical plane of the world becomes the tributary that returns us to the river of love. I can't explain the feeling really, only the experience and what I understand it to offer. What I can say for sure is that my Father has been alive and well inside my heart since that early morning blockage was released. I find him fully present inside me, just as real and vital and vibrant as ever. Sure, sometimes, perhaps often, I miss him in the physical dimension of living that is the world. I miss his voice. I miss his laughter. I miss his exuberance that could fill a room. But if I close my eyes, he's right here with all those qualities. After those few moments, I remember getting up, taking a deep breath, and approaching the doorway again to see if I could leave the room. I stood there in the doorway, looked back one more time to make sure I was not leaving anything of value about my Father behind. His body looked complete and released, and my heart felt full. Away I went. Now, I don't mean to paint a picture that everything was hunky-dory in the days to come. We returned home about 3 a.m, got a few hours sleep. But I woke up early. A few minutes later, Mom came walking out, shaking and crying. She sat down in what was Dad's chair at the dining table, saying, "I just can't do it, Richard. I just can't." I sat down in front of her, leaned over and put my hands on her knees and asked her to tell me what she meant, which she did. She proceeded to share that, quote, "I just can't go to the funeral and see all those people and pretend it's okay with me. It's not okay that Harold is gone." She cried and grieved and said what was needed. And then after about half an hour, she looked up, smiled, and said she was ready now and that we needed to start making calls. We sat there for a few more minutes, and I said I was sorry that she had lost her husband of so many years. I'd been so consumed with my own process, the loss of my father, that I'd forgotten how long they had been together, how much they had shared, and how much they loved each other. My loss paled in comparison to that. But something in my mother had shifted, and she was no longer shaking, and she just kept smiling as if she was thinking about something or looking into something. I asked her, and she said, quote, "It was just the perfect death for Harold. After an accident leaving his office, imagine that. He loved his work so much, it is just the best way that he could have gone." Grace had once again arrived in the midst of her tears, and a sense of peace arrived that could embrace the reality of the loss that was so poignant for her in that moment. Certainly over the years, Mom has had many, many moments of grief return, things to work through, the years of time without him. But something in her was permanently changed in that moment. Her heart was restored. Perhaps whatever it is that is called grace just prefers to show up when the pain is so prevalent, like the cavalry coming in to save the day. I suspect that many of you reading this will have had the opportunity, and you know I choose that word consciously, the opportunity to sit with someone when death arrives. And you thus may know what I mean about grace arriving so richly in those occasions. Those moments open us in ways that nothing else seems to be able to do. And into that opening, we can see so clearly those we love, how to love, and that in the end, it truly is only love that matters. Over the years, I've had the privilege of bearing witness to the most painful and heart-opening expressions of grief and loss from hundreds of people all around the world. From parents who have lost children, lovers taken from their partner far too early and with so much yet to be lived between them, and children who have lost parents at such a young age. I've now come to know all of those stories as variations of deeply painful yet profoundly lived love stories. Even though the form of our humanness is altered so completely with death, the grief illuminates the tributary that has enters us so that the heart can love again and in new and richer ways. If we do not fight the grief, but go into it like a miner digging for gold that is buried underneath it in the chambers of the heart, grace will be there to wash away the pain and leave the nuggets of love to be attended and polished for our lives ahead. In truth, I wish we didn't need to grieve as we do, as it is so painful. Yet over the years, I have made friends with grief and treated it as the very essence of my love, encased in some pain to be unveiled. The pain does its work, so the heart is free again. I'm going to read that last sentence. In truth, I wish we didn't need to grieve as we do, as it's so painful. Yet over the years, I have made friends with grief and treated it as the very essence of my love, encased in some pain to be unveiled. The pain does its work, and the heart is free to love again.